those opportunities can be taken up.
Speaker.
I call the honourable member Eugenie Sage.
Tēnā koe, Mr Speaker, and thank you. It's a tragedy, Mr Speaker, not that there has been a large area of windthrow, but it's a tragedy to hear the sentiments extolled by Mr Brownlee that we are not wealthy enough in this country to set aside some areas that we protect permanently where nature can rule and where we can experience nature on nature's terms. Because, Mr Speaker, that is why we have protected our conservation lands as places where nature dominates. We are a windy country. We have big snowstorms. We have big windstorms. Windthrow on the West Coast is nature in action. And if we are to be serious about setting aside parts of New Zealand to protect them for their own sake and for the sake of all of the species that call them home, if we are serious about protecting them so that present and future generations can experience something of the original New Zealand, then we don't open them up to mining, to oil and gas drilling, and now to logging, as this government is doing. It's because the National Party is stuck in the past with its destructive, short-term thinking that Mr Brownlee embodied in his speech. It's got economic policies which revolve around aggressive exploitation of nature. Dig it, drill it, frack it, irrigate it, and now log it. Mr Speaker, the West Coast forests are nature's cathedrals. You have the grand beech forests on the fertile river flats with their big branches. You have the rimu trees festooned with orchids and climbing plants. You can hear the call of the koromako, the tui, and if you're lucky at night, the kiwi. We respect these places in the Green Party. We would protect them, not open them up to chainsaws, to skidders, to haulers, and all of the damage that they will do. Because, Mr Speaker, conservation lands are supposed to be the areas that we set aside, but nothing is sacred to this national government, nothing at all. The Minister suggested yesterday that logging had occurred numerous times on conservation land. That was very misleading. Certainly it has occurred where there were past licences prior to the Conservation Act which allowed logging. It has occurred near Reefton where there's been a big open cast gold mine. But the Conservation Act deliberately prohibits the extraction of timber for commercial purposes from our protected areas. And that was quite deliberate because of what happened with the Forest Service prior to DOC's establishment. It, in a very perverse way, twisted the legislation at the time and twisted the concept of extracting dead trees to include dying trees and then to include living trees in the Kaimai Manakus. So Parliament deliberately, in Section 30 of the Conservation Act, prohibited the use of conservation land for logging for commercial gain. And that provision has enjoyed widespread public support for the last 27 years. Mr Brownlee, with his comments that waste of timber is a disgrace, shows a profound misunderstanding of basic ecology. Nature doesn't do waste. Death is part of nature's cycle. Trees aren't going to waste if they decay in the forest. They're an important part of the forest ecosystem. Where you have standing dead trees, they provide nesting holes for species like kaka and kakariki. And then when you have rotting trees on the forest floor, they store of carbon and they recycle nutrients back into the forest soils. Thousands of species, from fungi to insects to birds, rely on these rotting logs for food. And they provide home to these species. They provide moist sites for insects, which birds like kiwi need to feed on. And they provide ideal sites for regeneration for new forest giants. Though the Minister doesn't care or doesn't understand that rotting logs are an essential part of the forest ecosystem. So if you're not protecting the whole cycle of the forest, you are not protecting the forest at all. And I encourage the Minister and Mr Brownlee to read the blog by ecologist Michael North on Forest and Birds website, where he highlights just how much windthrow and the cycle of decay is a natural part of our forest system and a really important part of it. So, Mr. Speaker, past governments have progressively wound back logging of our magnificent Rimu and beech forests on public land in response to the public demand for their protection. We finally stopped logging on public land on the West Coast in 1999 as one of the first acts of a new Labor government to stop Timberland's destructive West Coast beach scheme. That scheme involved helicopter logging. It wasn't the gentle extraction of single logs from the forest. It was pockmarking the forest with an ugly series of 2 to 3 hectare clear cuts, and that's what we will get with this bill. And we stopped logging on public land for a very good reason. We need to protect what remains because we have been so successful in clearing, in burning, in converting to pasture and destroying the native forests that make these islands of Aotearoa so very special. Forests once covered 85% of New Zealand, some 23 million hectares. Yet in the space of just 25 to 30 generations, humans have reduced our forest cover to around 20% of our land area. That has had a devastating effect on our biodiversity, on our plants and our wildlife because of the loss of habitat. So the industry has been winding down because New Zealanders have pushed past governments to wind it down and to protect these areas, because New Zealanders see more value in the forests as habitat for plants, for wildlife and the species which make New Zealand special. No other country has birds like our flightless parrot, the kakapo, like the kiwi, which has got nostrils at the end of its beak. No other country has species like the giant weta, which performs the role of rodents in other countries. Our biodiversity is some of the most distinctive in the world. We have so many species which are only found here in Aotearoa. All of our reptiles, 90% of our insects, 80% of our vascular plants and 25% of our bird species. That's why we need to protect forests on conservation land, not open them up to logging. We have a biodiversity crisis with over 2,000 species threatened with extinction, yet what is the government doing? Not spending more on conservation to fund predator control, but opening up our public protected areas to logging. To change, yes, only money that you've managed to save because DOC didn't cut as many staff in its restructuring last year. Mr. Speaker, we are opposing this bill. The reason the government wants to push it through under urgency is because it knows that the public will oppose it when they understand that it's not just single tree extraction, that we will see logging trucks, skidders, haulers, heavy equipment on conservation land, destroying our forests, opening up large areas to weeds, destroying the ground conditions, destroying the natural drainage patterns, devastating a large area of forest in order to access the windthrow trees, because there is nothing in this bill which restricts the logging to helicopters. Instead, it will get the ground equipment used, the big heavy machinery, which has been so devastating in logging on the West Coast in the past. When you've been through a forest which has been logged, it is soul-destroying because it is such a desolate landscape, such a broken landscape. That is what this government is allowing by bringing the chainsaws back onto conservation land when Parliament 27 years ago deliberately decided that we shouldn't have logging for commercial gain.
I call the Honourable Joe Goodhue.
Mr. Speaker, it gives me much pleasure to rise and take a call in this debate as we